Storage retrieval and funding by Dr. Gary Beauvais.
Be up here, or what's your?
Here, is there
There's a dome.
Yes, yeah. Is there a slide? Thank you. And again, thanks for the opportunity to talk here. Thank you to Campbell County and ERG. Yep, my name is Gary Beauvais. I'm the director of the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database at the university, and I do want to talk about the status of the raptor nest database that was discussed as one of the main needs coming out of the 2015 Raptor Symposium. Very briefly, just as a quick reminder to most of you about what is the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database, or WIND, and why should we be involved here. We are a service and research unit of the university, and our job is to collect and organize and distribute good science on rare and important species and important habitats in the state of Wyoming, and then get that information out to whoever needs it. That's what we do. Our mission is purely informational. We have no statutory authority or regulatory authority or anything like that. We do what we do under the thinking that good decisions regarding natural resources are going to be made when everybody has access to really good information. People refer to us sometimes as sort of kind of like extension. We're a university scientific unit, and we push good science in useful formats out to people who need it out in the field. Similar to ag extension, it's just that we don't deal with agricultural science, we deal with ecological science, and we tend to deal with people like yourselves, managers, policymakers, resource developers, conservationists, who need this applied science, decision relevant. That's the new term I need to start using, decision relevant science, that the governor mentioned. We really don't do a lot of classic academic work that you might think of as coming out of a university. We're much more fundamental in the applied realm. And I think a lot of the work that we do is pretty fundamental to what a land-grant university should be doing for its state. Real quickly, we're organized into several programs. We have a very active program in vertebrate zoology or wildlife biology, and that's where our interest is in this realm of raptor ecology, but also an invertebrate team, a botany team, so on and so forth, a very strong database and mapping team that then provides services to all of those other groups. So the main topic here, the database here, I'm going to challenge your eyesight here. This is part of the cover from the 2015 symposium, and there's the conclusions. This one here, we should take steps towards a centralized statewide database of raptor nests. Participants in that symposium recognize that there is a lot of data. We all recognize there's a lot of data being collected, but it's not organized, it's not centralized, and it's not accessible. And if it were, then a lot of these questions could be answered from that big organized pile of data. It's a complicated task, and that is fundamental to the mission of WIND. That's why we wanted to take this on. It says we should take steps. Were they taken? Yes, creatively. We have had to be somewhat creative in how we've approached this. It's no news to anybody here that there was this sort of unusual coincidence between the 2015 Raptor Symposium and the general date of some of the budget challenges facing the state and certainly facing the University of Wyoming. And so we've had to be creative in how we've attacked this. The short story is that it's been a little difficult to generate funding to build this database, but there has been a lot of interest across agencies and across different players in the state for WIND to convert our overall database of observations of plants and animals in the state to a new technology, a new set of technologies, a new web-based platform. So we have done that. We've started to overhaul our central data system. We're quite a ways into that right now. And we've done that with raptor nest data in mind as an important subsystem or an important subcategory of data that we want to come out of this conversion being able to handle and being able to present to users like yourselves in a useful way. So that database transition has been supported hugely by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, by the governor's office and the BLM, and with the support of some industry groups as well. And again, it's intended to serve the needs of a whole range of groups in the state, dealing with not just raptors, but with all rare species, both plants and animals, in all sorts of different contexts. As a quick preview, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later, we have a beta version of the data upload part of this database that's being tested with the Game and Fish Department right now. We've completed the central database itself to hold all of these observation records, and we've loaded in there 1.8 million observation records of plants and animals made in the state of Wyoming. Some of those are raptor nest records. We haven't gotten really deep into plumbing the existing pool of raptor nest data just yet, because we want to make sure that we have the database ready to handle it in a very effective way before we start to put it in. So before I give a little bit more complete description of the system, I think it is worthwhile to remind ourselves a little bit about what is data and what data is not, so we can talk about what a database is and what a database is not. When we talk about data, we're talking about the measurements that are taken in the field, the observations that are made in the field. Think of the data as the raw facts. Here's a great graph that my major professor would hate because it has absolutely no labels on the axes whatsoever. So this is just for demonstration purposes. I don't even know what this data is. The data on this are the dots, right? These are the actual individual measurements. You can put a line through the middle of that cloud of data. You can model that with this line. That line is useful. It has some predictive value, but that's really a model. That's information. That's a higher level product that is built off of the data itself. So, in our context, we're talking about the data that comes out of the field are these observations of individual nests. If we can get those in an organized way where they stack well together because the data is standardized, all the fields are standardized, all the codes are the same, and we can put them on graphs like this and relate them to meaningful environmental gradients out there, then we can start to draw some good information. We can start to model it and come up with some good generalized information and predictive models. An easier way to think about it is that data are all of the boards stacked up in the warehouse. Really useful. Not as useful as if somebody takes them and models them into a house. A house is pretty useful, but that's information. The data are the boards themselves. One obvious extension of this analogy that I think is pretty important is that with different methods and with different end goals, you can come up with different houses from the same pile of boards. And that's true of any kind of modeling. You can build different models that take a different perspective on a particular scientific question from the same data, and that's valuable to look at it from multiple perspectives. This is an example of where we did that using the Wyoming pocket gopher, a rare rodent in south central Wyoming that was petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act a couple of times. We took all of the data, that is the observations of this species in the field, which are shown in these kind of faint pink dots here. We also took data in the form of places where Wyoming pocket gopher was sought and not found, shown as these black X's. We often refer to that as absent data or negative data. We took that data, we had it organized into database, and so we could build a statistical model with all sorts of spatial layers saying, where are the environments within which this species is likely to occur and the environments in which it's not likely to occur. And we did that in two different ways. We built two different houses out of that data. The output of one is shown in this dark blue. The output of the other model is shown in yellow, which is hard to distinguish, I know. And then where the two models overlap, where they both predict presence of this species, is in green. So it's a pretty valuable way to look at, in this case, predicted distribution of a species. But when you have organized data in an accessible database, this is the kind of stuff you can do. This is the kind of information you can draw from it and different ways to look at it. And this is the goal with getting all the raptor nest data organized so we can start to model it and look at it in some creative ways and draw some conclusions, and I would argue to draw spatially explicit conclusions. The question earlier was about mapping. Can we draw some maps from this data? Absolutely. What we hear all the time from people is, look, if you can take the science and map it, we can use it. And so we're building this data and we're approaching this problem with this spatially explicit approach in mind, to be able to put the science on a map. That's when managers can plan with it. That's when project operators can use it most effectively. I'm not going to go into this anymore because I think Mike Hillis and Gary Williams are going to give us a little bit more, a little better discussion of that. Cutting to the chase, if we understand what data is and what it can be used for, then what is a database? I would argue that a database has 6 different parts. This is, we'll put up a map of a database here. It starts with the most important parts. There's this dispersed source data out there that we all realize. All of this nest data out there in different files, different reports, different data repositories right now. And then there are users of that data, people that would like to use that data. The technical part of a database sits in between. It's connecting these two things here, taking this source data, organizing it, and getting it out here to those users. So the third part is a way to get that data into a core database. It's an interface, a data submission interface, and I appreciated the comments on hey, can we make these data forms digital? So that we can put the data in there, because if the data is digital, then it pours into a digital database really fast and easy, as opposed to somebody taking the muddy data sheets and typing in the data, from which we've all done, for weeks and weeks and weeks, typing in that handwritten data. The database itself, which oddly enough, when we talk about a database, the actual technical database that sits at the core is pretty fast and easy to build. What's really hard to build are the interfaces on either side, because you have the interface to get data into the database, then you have the interface that the users interact with to look at, to view, to query, and to download that data. Those are the hard parts, really, to build. And then what I think of first, but of course I think most people don't think of very often, is the most important 6th piece of a database, which is the people that sit on top of it and make sure that it continues to work, that data continues to get uploaded into it, that the technology remains up to date, that the data is quality checked and quality assured. That team is very important. Anyone in the database business learns pretty quickly that a digital collection of, in this case, raptor nest records, that's a biological collection just like any other biological collection, just like a pile of bones in a museum somewhere, or feathers, or a bunch of tissue samples somewhere. Those require curation and care and maintenance, And a digital database is no different. It requires people sitting on top of it and making sure that it remains up to date and functional. So we can take these pieces and look at them in just a little bit more detail. The data submission interface right now, as I mentioned, we have a beta version of this that's being tested right now. Clearly reflecting back to the discussion that we just heard from Gwen and Andrea, a key part of efficient data upload into a digital database is making sure that data is as standardized as possible when it comes to this interface. All we're asking these guys to do is to create a set of data forms that, where everyone uses the same protocol in the same way with the same sampling effort for all species, all the time, everywhere, forever. And then it'll work really easy. We aspire to that, and we're building the database so that it can handle that nice, even, completely standardized data that doesn't vary at all. And then we're also realistic, and we realize we'll never be in that world. So we have to be flexible enough to accept data that's still going to come in on somebody's homemade, muddy, handwritten data form. That's important data to get into the database. And maybe it doesn't have standardized codes. Maybe it doesn't have the same methods used to collect the data. We can build the database, and we are building the database to handle that kind of non-standard data as well and make sure that it stacks really well with the standardized stuff. And honestly, there's nothing we can do about the consistency of historic data. We have to take that in the form that it was collected. So we can't go back and ask people to recollect data from the 1980s in a new way. So we have to be kind of clever on how we build the database. Another thing to remember, and this is really important, we are building this system so that this input interface does real-time checks of incoming data. The best way to avoid errors getting into the database is to check for as many of those errors as possible before the data gets enrolled into the database. So an example, boy, I should have used different font color there, shouldn't I? That's hard to see. The best way to discuss this is through some made-up examples. Imagine somebody comes to the database with a record and they say, oh, Swainson's hawk, and I saw it on the 3rd of February, 2011. The system that we're building has some detectability date ranges built in, and it has range maps built in. The first thing that the system will do is to check that date and that species against those pieces of information, find an error. Wait a minute, this observation date does not match the detectability date for this species in Wyoming, and return immediately to the submitter a message like, hey, Swainson's hawk is not known to occur at this location at this time. Do you want to change this, or do you want to go ahead and continue with the submission? Because in our experience, a lot of errors like this, almost all errors like this are typos, or they're the fact that people wrote the data in kind of the wrong column in the data sheet, or other kind of honest mistakes. They're not mistakes of species identification or fundamental biology or anything like that. But unless you run these checks and you catch those right away, they get into the database, you lose track of who gave you that data, and it's hard to go back and correct them after the fact. Catch them right away and it works. Spatial errors are the same way. Somebody said, hey, there was a northern goshawk on a nest about a mile north of Reno Junction. The system would be able to check that against a map of the assumed breeding range of that species and say, you know what, this observation location is wrong. Northern goshawk is not known to nest at this location. Do you wish to modify that input? That would give the submitter a chance to go back and say, oh yeah, I meant northern harrier. I was tired that day. This happens all the time. Or maybe it was a wrong location. They just mistyped the UTM zone or something along those lines. That is not just for the raptor nests, but for a whole host of rare species data. We're really looking at this kind of initial screening to really catch a lot of these typo-style errors. The database itself, as I mentioned, it is mostly completed right now. We have uploaded 1.8 million observation records of about 6,000 plant and animal taxa in the state of Wyoming, mostly vertebrate animals, an increasing number of observations of rare invertebrate animals in the state as well. You may have heard the country has its first listed bumblebee under the Endangered Species Act. There's a couple in the state of Wyoming that are petitioned for listing right now. So our invertebrate team is gearing up to organize that data and get the state ready to deal with, and the Fish and Wildlife Service and everybody else ready to deal with that petition. We have a little bit of work to do here to make sure that we can link nest records with nest ID numbers and nest ID codes to make sure that that gets properly expressed through the user interface, but the database is largely finished at this point. Moving on to that final, that user interface. The biggest challenge that we have, the biggest hurdle we have to complete this whole system is to complete the user interface right now. That's where most of the work lies. And a lot of the work lies in making sure that we have a solid data security protocol in place so that sensitive records can be handled appropriately. They can get into the database, but then they can be released only to the people that they should be released to in the ways that they should be released. And that's something that we really have to make sure that we get down right. Getting records into a database is easy. Getting them out when there's data sensitivity issues is a little more difficult. How are we going to handle data sensitivity? We have a good data sensitivity policy in place at WIND. It's worked for a long time. It's actually established on law, on state code that's in the Wyoming Public Records Act. There's a special segment of the Wyoming Public Records Act relative to WIND and how we have to operate the database. So we'll just follow that. A sensitive record in our system, just as a real quick review of this, a record can be marked as sensitive for any one of three reasons. One, it was given to the system by a submitter or a donor who said, hey, keep this sensitive. Either you mark this as a sensitive record or I'm not even going to give you this record. That's a pretty easy situation. We would rather have the record and be able to distribute it to people in a manner which I'll go over with in a little bit, and in sort of a degraded manner, but still to give that record out, than to not have it at all. So we refer to this situation as donor sensitivity. Perhaps it's a record of a biological feature that is considered especially vulnerable to disturbance. Rattlesnake dens are often targeted by collectors. Working with the Game and Fish Department, we've determined that we're going to call all snake dens sensitive because they are sensitive to exploitation by collectors. A lot of other features, bat roosts, for example, some big bat hibernacula are sensitive. So this is kind of a judgment call, and it's on a case-by-case basis and a species-by-species basis. As opposed to the donor sensitivity, we refer to this as biological sensitivity, and it's pretty easy for us to manage and pretty understandable. The one that everybody worries about, and should, and we worry about it a lot, is the instances of records that fall on private land. And this is where the Wyoming Public Records Act code really helps us out here. If a record maps to private land, and it is available in another publicly accessible data repository, perhaps it comes out of a published paper, or it sits in a museum database somewhere, it's not sensitive. But if it's not available elsewhere, then it becomes sensitive. Or if it maps to private land and that landowner has not given permission for precise scale distribution of that record, then it also becomes sensitive because we want to protect landowner security, landowner privacy. So in the case that a record meets one of these conditions and is sensitive, how do we deal with it? Well, again, probably the best way to illustrate that is in sort of a made-up example. Imagine a non-sensitive record. Somebody observes a red-tailed hawk nest right here at this very precise location. And it's on, say, public land. It's on BLM surface. They give it to the system. They say, no, don't consider it donor sensitive. It's not especially biologically sensitive. It's a non-sensitive record. It'll go into the system at that precise scale, and when people pull it out of the system, it'll come out at that precise point scale. It's non-sensitive. There's no reason why we shouldn't distribute that point location out to everybody. If it is sensitive, say it maps onto private land, and the landowner has not given permission for that record to be distributed out there, and it can't be found in another publicly accessible database. How do we deal with it? It goes into the system at this precise scale, But when somebody queries that record back out, you go to the system and say, hey, are there any red-tailed hawk nests in this area? What you're going to see is there is a red-tailed hawk nest somewhere in this township. Somewhere in this 6 mile by 6 mile township, there is a red-tailed hawk nest, and it was observed on this date, and all of the rest of the information in that record will come along, except any information that could be used to locate that nest to a scale more precise than the township. And this township level distribution, again, it's worked for us in the past. It's in the Wyoming Public Records Act. It allows us to protect records at this scale so that they can't be pinpointed to any particular land ownership. So again, as we're completing this, this user interface, making sure that this is implemented well and is rock solid is going to be one of our biggest concerns. And then, the last part, right? The database maintenance team. That's 15, right now it's 15 full-time biologists and database professionals at the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database. We're committed to building this system for all rare species in the state, including raptor nests. To get back to the main idea of this, and I'm sure, people are saying, all right, get to it, numbers. When are we going to have it? When's the system going to be live? We estimate in about 12 months we'll have a version 1 of a system that you can interface with over the web and query raptor nest data out in a useful form. It's not going to have all the bells and whistles that we want, and we still have to fundraise for it. We still have to raise some money to get there, but we estimate in a year we can have a version 1. I suspect version 2 is going to be what everyone really wants, where there's going to be a few more bells and whistles, a few more, a little more ability to query raptor nest data out in some more useful ways. That's probably another 12 months beyond that. But version 1 will be useful, and it will be populated with a bunch of data, and we've got some support right now to go and get some of the legacy data and start to put it into the database. And I want to make sure I work with Andrea and Gwen as well to get some of the current data in there to really refine the system. So given that we can raise the funds, which we're confident we can do, and as you might imagine, I'd love to speak to anybody who would be interested in this. We're looking at about a year out, I think. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, except the hard ones. It's a little bit of a moving target, but how much do we need? That's what she said. She doesn't have her checkbook out, though. Because again, the raptor nest database think of it as a subsystem within this larger database of rare species information across the board, plants and animals for the state as a whole. It depends on who else comes on board to fund other parts of it, right? If we get a funder who says, you know what, I'm all about those listed plants in the state, I want to contribute some money to WIND to develop this part of the database, that pushes the raptor nest database forward a little bit as well. 60,000 over the next year. Honestly, that's what we came up with. It was actually 50 to 75. So we're guessing about 60,000 over the next 12 months will get us to this version 1.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lauren Troop. I work for Hayden Wing and Laramie Wildlife Consulting. This is really cool, so I'm excited about it. My question is, our company, and I know a lot of consulting companies, use the data from a bunch of different databases and pull it all into our database, and one of the biggest problems we run into are duplicate records, and they can be really hard to parse that out. And with this kind of database, I could see how, wildlife individual observations, you wouldn't need to worry about that. If you see different individuals in the same place, that's not a problem. But with raptor nests, it's a big problem. So just kind of curious if you guys have thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. The duplicate record problem is a huge problem. So you go out and you observe a ferruginous hawk nest somewhere, and you develop that record, and you contribute it to us. Andrea flies over the next day and sees that same nest, sends that data to us. We consider that 2 different records because they were made by different observers on different days. So that, in our mind, is not a duplicate record. That's just multiple observations of a particular feature. That's good information to have. But if you see it and you submit the record to us, but you also submit your observation to Andrea and she submits it to us, and it happens to be on Thunder Basin, so you gave it to Tim as well, and then Tim says, hey, Gary, put this record in the database too. Then we have 3 copies of the same record, and that's a duplicate record problem there. And we've dealt with that for years, and there's ways to deal with that. There's some routines that we can run that look at the location of a particular record and the date on which the observation was made and the species for which it was made, and it can alert us to likely duplicate record problems. Now the locations are not always exactly the same because you recorded it in NAD 83 on your GPS, but when you gave it to Tim, he didn't know that, and he converted it to another datum before he gave it back to us, so they're mismapped a little bit. So, but we see through little tricks like that, and we can figure out how to get around that too. So the short answer is it's hard, but we can deal with it and try to eliminate those.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the main issue that we see sometimes, even if they're not duplicate records, is their observations, different observations of the same nest. And so when you pull the information out, it's hard to tell if are there 4 different nests within a few hundred square meters or something, or is it multiple survey points for one nest? And so even if you can differentiate like my survey point from Andrea's, I guess that fundamental question of
can we attach them to the same nest?
Yeah.
So that when you pull the data from the database, nest, number 37A was observed on this day, and it was also observed on this day.
Yeah.
And that information goes to the same nest. That's exactly how we're building the raptor nest subsystem of the database, and that's why it is a subsystem. The good news is that if we can figure out how to do this for raptor nests, and I think we've figured it out, it can also apply to things like multiple nests of bat roosts, or multiple observations of bat roosts, multiple observations of trumpeter swan breeding ponds, multiple observations of other features that we want to attach observations to. So when you query the database, you can say, I want to see all unique nests, and I want to see the data trace on all unique nests. One big part of that is to make sure that nests are coded very consistently. So when you make an observation and you say this is nest 37A, and when Andrea then comes the next day and makes an observation, she also says that's nest 37A. We know that's not always true, and that nest codes have changed over time. So we're going to have to build a Rosetta Stone back there that kind of translates all these different names for nests into one name. And honestly, what we may come out of this with is sort of a grand Wyoming numbering scheme for raptor nests, that no matter what you happen to call it individually, by company or by consultant or what it was called in the past, we may lump all that up to one unchanging number that we can then hinge all of this to.
Gary, one of the things you showed where in your data set that if you've got a bird that shows up outside of its normal range, so you've got a bird in here that should only be in the summertime, it's showing up in the winter. But what happens if, along the same lines of what they were just talking about, Lauren submits one that says, I saw a golden eagle sitting on this nest. 2 days later, Andrea flies over and she identifies it as a bald eagle.
Right.
Inside the right breeding season, inside the right breeding habitat, do you have the same kind of a system that flags it because you've got 2 different observations at the same location with 2 different species?
We would include those in the database as 2 different observation records at the same point. So they would be at the same point, but they would differ in species, and they would differ in observer, and they would differ in day. So they'd be separate records. We wouldn't make the call whether one was right and one was wrong. We would include them in there. This is that matter of making sure that We are recording the data. That is the data that came from, that is the measurement that was made that came from her and came from her. We put that in there. We don't interpret the data first and then put it in. We just put it in. Was there an error? Most people would look at that and say, uh-oh, someone was wrong. It was either a bald or a golden. It probably wasn't both. Okay, we leave it at that and make sure that is recorded because that's what came out of the field.
So just as clarification on that, the arbitration of conflicting record entries would have to be then essentially pursued by whoever is trying to solve that particular issue of an occupied versus unoccupied nest or two different species observed using the same nest in the same season. Then we would have to get the information about each of the observers and then kind of pursue it that way?
Exactly.
Okay.
The data would be recorded in the system, and we could query the system to find those situations. Hey, tell us where there were two different species on the same nest in the same season. Hey computer, tell us where that is, and it would kick those records out, and then we could say, there might be errors here. We need to go back and interview the observers. We need to follow up on this. But we don't want to change the base data. We don't want to say, you know what, I'll bet it was a bald eagle. So we'll just change the species identification on the first record that came in where it said it was a golden. In data science, that's a big no-no, right? You don't make a judgment call and then change the fundamental measurement.
Gregory Kennett, ERG. We were looking at some data a couple of years ago where we dug into it and looked at the observer, and the observer turned out to be somebody who was a project opponent, and they had reported a species that was unusual in the area. I mean, is there any way to flag those things that seem really out of the ordinary?
In that case, there would be a record in the database with an observer name, a location, a species, and a date. The database is agnostic to things like who supports a project or who might not or who might oppose it. But because we've recorded that fundamental information in the record, then someone could go back and say, really, there was a really weird, rare species right here. Let me look farther into that record. Just like, hey, there might have been a species identification. Let's look a little farther into that record. We want to record what was given to us and then let people interpret after the fact if they want to adjust their own interpretation of that record.
How do you keep track of private records taken on private lands? Those permission slips?
We don't get the permission, right? When the data comes to us from you or from anyone here, you're submitting a data set to the system. And so we say, we make the assumption, first of all, this was legally collected data. You had permission to go and collect this data. If it maps to private surface, then we enter that data sensitivity protocol and say, wait a minute, this is likely a sensitive record, so we need to make sure that it's handled appropriately and we don't reveal point locations. But the database managers can't get in the business of making sure that data was collected legally. It's like any other website you get into. There will be, when you get into the data submission interface, there will be that big long screen of blah blah that you have to say, yeah, I accept. When it says, by submitting data to this system, you are agreeing that this was collected legally and that you're submitting actual factual data and you're not trying to game the system and whatever else all that blah blah says that nobody reads, then when you click I agree to get into the system.
So you're the one trying to keep Mr. Friedenthal employed.
That's it. Yeah, we have a deal with him.